Now we're going to talk about the height of the Qin dynasty, the great unified state that was established by Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of all of China. We're going to take a look at how he centralized Chinese civilization and paved the way for the Han dynasty, which came after, the Han dynasty being the quintessential Chinese dynasty in which Chinese identity solidified. That's why we call ethnically Chinese people today Han Chinese. But going back to Qin Shi Huangdi, he was a great warrior. He would lead his armies from the front. He had inherited the throne of Qin, a country to the northwest, one of the warring states. And he had very, very efficient, very ruthless ministers. We've already talked about legalist ministers earlier with the first video. He continued this process. And one thing that he did is that he insisted on standardizing weights, measures, and script. That way commerce would be more efficient in his empire, and particularly communication, because each individual region had its own variant of the different Chinese characters. And this helped unify society culturally because everyone could read and write the same material. Also, he became megalomaniacal later on in his life. He had instituted a very, very, very strict authoritarian government in the legalist mode, in which if you broke a law, you went out of line some way, the punishments could be very, very severe. And this kind of great power went to his head. Eventually, he started to go crazy. He sent his ministers out on a mission for an elixir of life, an elixir of immortality, rather, a drink that would keep him alive, obviously. He sent ministers east. There's a legend that one of them found what's now Japan. He sent one of them west, one of them south, one of them north. But that's neither here nor there. What we do know is that his physician gave him mercury, and it was believed that mercury would keep him alive. Of course, we now know that mercury is poison, and what was actually happening was he was being mentally damaged by this mercury, poisoned, and over time it began to eat away at his mind. He had ordered one of his ministers to go out and lash the ocean because he was trying to order the tide back into the ocean, and it disobeyed him. This is kind of the megalomania that he succumbed to later in his life. In fact, one of the reasons that his dynasty fell is that after his death, there was massive discontent. He had unified the country and done China a great service from that perspective, but he also killed so many people, caused so much destruction, that he's actually a mixed figure in terms of how he's viewed by modern Chinese and Chinese throughout the centuries. What happened first to end his dynasty is that when his son attempted to take over the Qin state, there was a work detail of peasants led by a man named Chen Shi. And Chen Shi was leading peasants to go and complete a public works project when they were delayed by a thunderstorm. Well, they managed to find shelter, but they were going to be late. And the penalty for showing up late to a public works project was death. So Chen Shi said to his comrades, we're going to die anyway, so why not revolt? Why not try to make our own dynasty? And they agreed to this. And they started the first of several rebellions that would ultimately overthrow the Qin dynasty and establish the Han dynasty. Qin Shi Huangdi was a magnificent builder. One expression of his great power was monumental architecture. He often had the laws carved into stone and placed at different points throughout the empire so that there would be no ambiguity as to what the laws were. He also wanted to protect the northern border. And for this, he established the Great Wall of China. The reason for this is that you had horse nomads, people who moved from place to place with flocks of sheep, goats, and cattle, horses. And these horse nomads would break into the border. They would raid villages, take slaves, destroy property, steal, and then they would disappear back out into the grasslands before the Qin army could muster and fight them. So Qin Shi Huangdi wanted to create a wall so that they would not be able to come in. And this wall was successful. It managed to keep the nomads from breaking in, and it stabilized northern China in a way that it had not been stabilized previously from the nomadic threat. This came at a cost, though. In order to build the wall, a massive amount of conscript labor was required. We're looking at around 1 million people who died building this wall. In fact, there is a legend that for every meter of the wall, someone gave his or her life. In fact, there are supposed to be human bones buried in the foundations of the wall at places. And of course, this wall was massive. You have towers every so often, and they're communicating via smoke signals, and you can imagine how quickly a message would travel from one end to the other over great distances if you're using smoke signals. Well, this was how the different parts of the wall communicated and prepared for a foreign attack. When the wall was manned properly and the government was attentive to repairing it and keeping it intact, China was largely invulnerable to the invasion of nomads. It was only when civil war occurred and the government began to forget about the Great Wall that we start to see nomads breaking through the Great Wall like Genghis Khan did and causing great damage in northern China. Also, Qin Shi Huangdi built a great tomb for himself. The tomb of the first emperor, the great mausoleum in which he was buried, is one of the great archaeological sites of world history. The army that was contained within, the terracotta army, consists of over 8,000 figures. They're life-size. There are, I think, 520 horses also included, as well as mounted soldiers and chariots. Now, these soldiers, there are weaponry. This is like an army on the move. And one thing to note is that if you look at each of these soldiers individually, you'll see that they have their own unique faces. That's because Qin Shi Huangdi had the sculptors create this terracotta army based on his own soldiers. So that is an expression of his great power. If you notice, you can see the armor there on their chests. It looks like little rectangular pieces put side by side. That's called lamellar armor. It's a type of armor where you have either iron or leather little plates, mixtures of both possibly, stitched together into kind of a coat. And this was very flexible, but it also allowed the individual a lot of protection. And of course, it was cheap enough to make so that the ordinary soldier could have this supplied to him by the state. It's important to note here that the Qin state was supplying soldiers with weaponry and armor long before most other states did this. In most of history, when you were conscripted into an army or you volunteered to join some fighting unit, you had to bring your own armor and arms and horses. So this is a notable development. And this is the result of this legalist economy that was very, very efficient in harnessing its resources and spending them towards war. Also, if you take a good look at the weaponry, and you can see where the one that says G, dagger axe there, that was the main weapon of the Qin army. There's an officer's sword. The dagger axe was used to punch through armor. In fact, you can see the blades there. These were pushed onto the side of the pole arm, usually with a spear tip above it, so that you could thrust and also chop. You can see here a Qin soldier in his lamellar armor with his dagger axe. Of course, the most lethal weapon of all was the crossbow, which was also the pinnacle of military technology when it was invented in China, several centuries before the unification of China under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. The crossbow was useful not just for its power. A peasant could be trained to use it relatively quickly, as compared to a bow, which could sometimes take years to perfect. The crossbow also enabled mass warfare. Tens of thousands of crossbowmen protected by tens of thousands of soldiers with the dagger axes, shooting bolts at each other, and a crossbow shoots a bolt, not an arrow, firing back and forth, and this created a massive amount of casualties. One of the victims of this kind of conflict was chivalry. Prior to this period, if you had a battle, you would have the nobility meet up. They would determine a place for battle. They would determine a time. And usually the battle would largely consist of the nobility coming out and fighting duels, one-on-one, sometimes with bows and arrows, sometimes with pole arms, sometimes with swords, fighting one-on-one in front of their armies to determine the winner. And usually there would be a small clash of the various armies, but not the kind of kill or be killed fighting that would come along with the crossbow. And of course, with the crossbow, the lethality of the battlefield also meant that generals had to really refine their tactics, both tactics and strategy. And the lethality meant that surprise attacks, using fire, attempting to attack your enemy when he's disadvantaged. All of the different techniques that were included in Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I'm going to talk about that at a later time. But Sun Tzu, in some ways, was an adaptation to the crossbow. He was adapting his tactics, and tactics are what you do kind of on the ground in battle. Strategy is your overall plan for the war. He wanted to adapt his tactics to meet the demands of warfare caused by this new lethal weapon. The Qin army was very efficient, as stated earlier. The government was very efficient, and one of the priorities of the government was to squash any dissent and any competing ideas. The way that the Qin government did this is through the banning of books. If a book wasn't concerned with medicine, war, agriculture, or divination, which is trying to discern the future, it was made illegal. The Qin government did not want people reading about philosophy, about art, etc. And if you were found expressing these kinds of opinions, you were put to death. In fact, we'll talk about Confucianism in a moment. There is a famous episode in which the Qin government buried Confucian scholars alive. They were hiding books, they were hiding the Confucian classics, and they were seen as a threat to the state simply for their opinions. And they were killed for it. And this is one of the most infamous events in Chinese history, one for which the first emperor and the Qin have never been forgiven by historians.